PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Tim Shipman.
So here we go again then, PMQs Unpacked, where we pause the action live from the House of Commons to try and explain what is going on between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer not had a great week since last we met, Tim Shipman.
Well, he has slightly fewer support staff, as you said. He's lost both of his communications experts, his political director and his chief of staff has moved. They were told he's still very important and very much still there. But those people looking at a by-election a week on Thursday and thinking Keir Starmer might need a reset, a relaunch after that, are slightly wondering why he's doing all this now.
And it's sort of, there's not a huge amount of logic to it. And you do wonder, you're right, if he has a bad result on in the Batley and Spain by-election next week, does he have to find some more people to sack?
Well, potentially, or he needs to do some kind of reshuffle, or he just tried one of those and it wasn't an abundant success in the Westminster Village, I think it's fair to say. But, you know, the public out there probably don't care for a couple of years who's on his front bench, and they certainly don't care who's in his back office. They care whether he turns up and does a decent job on a Wednesday, and whether he's got anything interesting to say about the issues they care about. And that will become clear as we move on.
A week ago, at exactly this time, we were talking about the text message released by Dominic Cummings in which Boris Johnson called Matt Hancock totally effing useless. Hopeless, yeah. Accuracy is important. Keir Starmer didn't raise it at any point. It became a sort of big talking point as to whether or not this is proof of Keir Starmer, being unable to think on his feet, depending on who you spoke to in the Labour Party. It was either deliberate, because they didn't want to do Dominic Cummings' dirty work for him. It was deliberate because they wanted to concentrate on the more important matters of borders, or nobody could be expected to have done it because it only came only a few minutes before PMQ started. What does Keir Starmer need to do this week to sort of reassure people who are in the Labour Party, Labour MPs, who will tell you and I privately they're a bit worried?
But he needs to look like he's got building an argument through 6 questions, and he needs to make Boris Johnson uncomfortable, take the mickey out of him, pick on a subject that people care about, and hit hard. I think there's a general feeling that Starmer is someone who doesn't go quite as crunchingly hard into the tackle as some of the things we've been witnessing on our screens in Euro 2020.
So let's play a game of what could Keir Starmer ask about?
Well, I rather wonder whether he might bring up your own morning obsession. The government seems to be bending over backwards to help UEFA bring people in. Starmer has had problems with border controls over COVID, and it's quite a populist thing to go after, saying, well, why can't my kid have a sports day, but a bunch of UEFA suits are allowed to waltz in for the football. You've got, the potential for holidays opening up. There's announcements due on that later this week and early next week. I wonder whether he might pick a little bit at the scab that the Sunday Times identified at the weekend. There seem to be divisions between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer over spending and tax and how that's all going to pan out during the autumn. That might be something Starmer might want to have a go at as well. But in a sense, it doesn't matter too much what it is, as long as he makes a decent fist of it.
Yeah. And actually, it's what all of those things could potentially, in the terms of, having an impact and all that. People say, oh, no normal person watches PMQs. This is an opportunity to get yourself in the news. I do wonder.
Well, this was the problem last week.
Maybe you should hire you and I. Sports days. Go on sports days. It's what everyone's talking about.
I think that would be the most populist way to do it, which may be why he doesn't.
My Twitter's absolutely lit up. People are going completely...
my WhatsApp groups are absolutely buzzing with sports
wild
days.
About it. A sports
Some
days.
of them even quoting yourself, Matthew.
Are they?
Your tweets have appeared in my WhatsApp groups multiple times this morning.
Good Lord. There's just so many. Can you imagine the outcry? I think it would have reached a final. But there was some people defending it and saying that they were right to let the UEFA in. Someone saying
they might well be right to let them in, but can we have school sports days as well?
Yeah, get your daughter's school needs to join needs to join UEFA. You just need to invite some VIPs and it'll be able to go ahead. We couldn't attend our daughter's first ever sports day recently.
But what Starmer needs is for people to be talking about the issue he's talking about, not talking about whether or not he should have raised a different issue. And you know, all those three different interpretations you laid out, they're all about the process and whether or not he should have done something else. They weren't about what he wanted to talk about. And for that reason, it was a big mistake last week.
And he's got two choices as leader of opposition. You either try to start a new conversation, which is quite difficult, or identify a conversation which is going on and stick yourself at the top of it, and then you probably stick yourself at the top of the news bulletins too.
Absolutely, that's what the game is.
Right, well, there we are. Boris Johnson at the dispatch box. His hair is looking, I'd say, sort of medium haystack, Boris Johnson's hair. He's looking reasonably smart, shirt and tie. Right, we can go live to the House of Commons then. Question number one, Keir Starmer, is he going to be taking our advice? Let's find out.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why, under this government, has the number of rape convictions and prosecutions fallen to a record low?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one of the first things I said when I came to this dispatch box as Prime Minister was that I thought that rape prosecutions and convictions were too low, and that's why we have the end-to-end rape review, and that's why we've been investing in independent sexual violence advisors and independent domestic violence advisors, another 27 million. That's why we've been investing more in the Crime Prosecution Service, another 85 million people. We're also dealing with the misery experienced by rape victims and survivors who have to hand over their mobile phones, Mr. Speaker, which I think has been one of the evidential problems that has arisen in prosecuting rape cases. But what we've also been doing, Mr. Speaker, is imposing tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offences. And it would have been good to have some support in that from the right honourable gentleman and the benches opposite.
Right, well, it turns out once again, Keir Starmer's not listening to us.
No, but what he's done there is he's in a tricky spot and he's gone very much to his home turf, just like England wanting to play at Wembley. He is a former chief prosecutor and he's gone with prosecution as his subject. He knows it inside out. He doesn't need a backroom team to prep him on this one. I'm sure Starmer put all this together himself. And what he wants is a solid outing on something he knows about, and that's why he's chosen this one. And it's obviously a very important issue, and it's though it's interesting, it's something that the government themselves did something about, a week or so ago.
Yeah, it was the end of was it Thursday night into Friday. The Justice Secretary Robert Buckland apologised to victims, rape victims, and promised to do a lot better. He said ministers felt they feel deeply ashamed of low conviction rates for rape cases in England and Wales, admitted there were budget cuts, were partly to blame for convictions falling to a record low in recent years. That was an interview with the BBC last week. Earlier on this week, David Lowy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland's opposite number, said the apology was rendered meaningless following the release of the end-to-end rape review after the Justice Secretary described the target to increase prosecutions to 2016 levels as constitutionally illiterate. So let's go back and see where Keir Starmer takes this next.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we all agree that the figures are appalling. The question is why? The government's own review makes clear that rape convictions and prosecutions have halved since 2016. Halved. We know that's nothing to do with the pandemic because this is a 5-year trend. We know it isn't because there are fewer rape cases being reported because that number's gone up significantly. So let me return to the question that the Prime Minister hasn't answered. Why does the Prime Minister think that rape prosecutions and convictions have plummeted on his watch?
Prime Minister.
Because, Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, because he has some experience of this matter, there are considerable evidential problems, particularly in recovering data from mobile phones, and that has been an obstacle to the speedy preparation of cases. And too often, let's be frank, too often cases go from the police to the Crime Prosecution Service not in a fit state, and too often those cases are not in a fit state when they come to court. And there is not a good enough join-up, Mr. Speaker, across the criminal justice system. And that is exactly what we are addressing, Mr. Speaker, now by our investments with our end-to-end rape review. And what would be good, Mr. Speaker, is if we could have some support from the opposition for tougher sentences for rapists and serious sexual offenders. What kind of a signal does it send when they won't even back tougher sentences, Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Well, it's just the same question, the same answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's Johnson, as ever, is throwing it back at Starmer and saying, why didn't you back our bill? The point Starmer's making is not so much about the sentencing, but about how you progress cases through and get convictions. But as I say, the government have already acknowledged there's a problem. And Starmer's doing this thing that he often does, where he sort of says, why did this happen? As if he wants a sort of mea culpa that he's never going to get from Boris Johnson.
Exactly. So it feels like what he's trying to do is get Boris Johnson to repeat what Robert Buckland said on the telly last week, which was that this report into rape revealed that at all stages of the criminal justice process, frankly, a failure to deal with complaints made by many thousands of victims. The first thing I need to say is sorry, it's not good enough. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Robert Buckland and Michael Ellis, the Attorney General, wrote a foreword to the review saying the vast majority of victims do not see the crime against them charged and reach a court. 1 or 2 victims withdraw from rape investigations. These are trends of which we are deeply ashamed about. So clearly, Keir Starmer is trying to get Boris Johnson to repeat that on the record in the way that several senior ministers did last week.
Yeah, well, he ought to know Boris Johnson well enough to know that he's unlikely to use the phrase "I'm deeply ashamed" in the chamber of the House of Commons.
Well, let's go back. Let's see if it'll be interesting to see if Keir Starmer's planning, because it can often be quite effective to pick several different topics, or if he's going to use all 6.
Well, he could pivot to money as well. There's a big crisis in the courts. There's a huge backlog of cases. You could move on to that, and the lack
of funding.
That
ministers are on the record as saying that a lack of funding is in part to blame. Let's go back to this Commons.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows very well why we voted against his bill, precisely because it did more to protect statues than women.
Quite a good line.
But since he's brought it up, Mr. Speaker, let's address the central question. Prime Minister, 98.4% of reported rapes don't end up in a charge. 98.4%. And therefore the question of sentence never arises in those cases. So since he's brought up the bill, it's his main defence, it seems. Can he tell me, point to what provision in the bill, what clause, what chapter, what part of that bill will do anything to change the fact that 98.4% of reported rape cases don't end in charges and don't get to sentence? Which clause, part, chapter or words in that bill? Point to one thing.
Mr. Speaker, well, let me point to section 106 and 107 of that bill, which Labour voted down, Mr. Speaker, which would have stopped the early release of rapists at their halfway point in their sense. What kind of a signal, what kind of a message does that send, Mr. Speaker, to people who commit the crimes of rape? It is very, very important that the message should go out from this House of Commons that we will not tolerate serious sexual violence. And I'm afraid that the right honourable gentleman has not been supporting that message. What we are doing now is bringing forward measures by investing in independent domestic violence, independent sexual violence advisors to ensure that victims and survivors of the crime of rape have people in whom they can confide and trust throughout that miserable period when they're in the criminal justice system. And another thing we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is recruiting record numbers of police officers. And I'm proud to say that 40% of our new recruits are female, Mr. Speaker, which I believe will be a great consolation and use to those who are victims and survivors of rape.
Starmer.
Well, the most surprising thing about that is that Keir Starmer asked a very specific question. Point to a single part of your bill which helps victims, and Boris Johnson did.
Yes, he even knew the section numbers. I don't think he quite answered the bit that Starmer was asking, but he was able to throw back in his face that you didn't vote for this bit relating to early release of convicted rapists. I mean, again, they're still talking across each other. Starmer's talking about how you get people into jail. Johnson's talking about what you do with people once they're in jail and how long you keep them there. But, it's an important subject, but it's not gaining us a great deal of ground politically, I don't think.
Yeah, and partly because it was done it covered quite extensively latter part of last week and into the weekend, and so maybe
it's unlikely to be picked up as a news story because this was big news 5-6 days ago.
Yeah, exactly right. And given clearly that Boris Johnson is not going to Boris Johnson is not about to play the game that Keir Starmer is asking him to play. Well, let's go back to the comments.
What an appalling answer. I asked him why 98.4% of cases aren't getting into the system, and he talks about a sentence. But that is the problem. If the Prime Minister thinks that's the answer, that is why we've got these terrible rates of conviction and of prosecution. The answer is there's nothing in that bill. The truth is, victims of rape are being failed. Now, Mr. Speaker, they're not just my words, they're in the government's own report. Victims of rape are being failed. There's no escaping that appalling figure, Prime Minister. 98.4% of rape cases ending without anybody being charged. And those that do get in the system take years to go through. Does the Prime Minister accept that cuts to the criminal justice system have contributed to that appalling situation?
Prime Minister!
No, Mr. Speaker, because we've increased the numbers of people in the CPS by at least 200, Mr. Speaker, specifically dedicated to helping to prosecute the crime of rape and sexual violence. And, Mr. Speaker, we are absolutely determined to stamp it out. This is a problem that has been going worse because of the evidential difficulties caused by the data recovery process and the lack of unity, the lack of joined-up thinking between all parts of the criminal justice system. That is something that this government is now addressing by more investment, by putting more police out on the street, and also by having tougher sentences. And finally, it would be good to hear him support it.
Keir Starmer!
I'm not sure.
Well, you're huffing and puffing, but so was Keir Starmer, at the start of that answer, condemning Johnson for an appalling answer and then literally spluttering with frustration. And this is often what we get with a situation where Johnson happily, merrily blusters through and Starmer gets frustrated that he's not answering the specific question. It's his job to pin him down. Interesting, in the answer, Johnson did manage to come up with a number there for the number of extra CPS staff, in 200, which one suspects is more correct than the answer he gave in response to the first question, where he claimed that 85 million more people had gone to work for the CPS, which is more than the entire population of the United Kingdom. One presumes it was £85 million to pay for 200 people.
I do wonder if the reason that Boris Johnson seems to be so prepared for this, with quite a lot of detail in it, he seems to be across it all, is partly because the Labour Party has been banging away at this for all the last week. David Lammy in particular, David Lammy was tweeting about an hour ago, Keir Starmer retweeted it. So it was clear they were putting up in lights as something he was likely to go on. Do you think this, because this is clearly an issue that resonates particularly with Labour MPs, the line about there's more protection for statues than women got a big cheer in the House of Commons, is this actually about shoring up his position in the party a bit more, rather than even worrying about whether or not... I mean, he's not going to get onto the news with this, is he?
No, and I think we've seen this in recent weeks on a number of occasions. He had a question either last week or the week before about Palestine, which was very much one for the home team, as it were. And there's an element about this, I suspect.
OK, let's go back to the comments. Keir Starmer again.
Mr. Speaker, I spent 5 years as Director of Public Prosecution prosecuting thousands of rape cases. I don't need lectures, but I do know the impact of cuts on our criminal justice service. The government can't make cuts, significant cuts to the Crown Prosecution Service, 25% cuts to the Ministry of Justice, close half the courts in England and Wales, yes, half the courts, and now pretend that a small budget increase will solve the problem. But, Mr. Speaker, this is more than just about cuts. The rate review is welcome, but it's weak. The Victims Commissioner, the government's Victims Commissioner, described the review as underwhelming. It could have been 10 times stronger. That review is littered with pilots and consultations on proposals that have literally been discussed for years and years. It is so unambitious. Mr. Speaker, isn't it the case that despite these shameful figures, and they are shameful, the government still isn't showing the urgency needed to tackle the epidemic of violence against women and girls?
Minister!
No, Mr. Speaker, because we've also brought in the landmark domestic violence bill, which, again, it would have been good if we'd had wholehearted support from the Labour Party opposite. And Mr. Speaker, no, because this government has brought in much tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. And he can't, no matter how much he wriggles and squirms, Mr. Speaker, he can't get away from the simple fact that on a 3-line whip, he got his party to vote against tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders. That Mr. Speaker, is weak.
Well, Boris Johnson getting quite fired up there. Boris Johnson clearly thinks that his piece of legislation is very good. You're right. This is essentially two conversations happening in parallel. Keir Starmer's talking about how do we get more cases, allegations of rape and sexual assault into the system, and Boris Johnson's talking about tougher sentences at the end of the process.
Yeah, I mean, Boris Johnson has answered that to a degree. Everyone knows that everyone's mobile phone is now stuffed with information, and sometimes there's evidence of rape, in people's messages, and sometimes there's evidence that they had a pre-existing relationship, and that has grossly complicated the whole situation. But yeah, Boris Johnson getting quite fired up there. Interestingly, the sort of protection of women and girls was a big thing when he was Foreign Secretary. He did quite a lot of that on the international stage. One of the themes of the summit, the G7 summit in Cornwall that he chaired a couple of weeks ago, was about helping women and girls in the third world. It's obviously a subject that his new wife Carrie is very interested in. This is something on which Boris Johnson sort of feels that is something he's been doing something about. Maybe not specifically on what Starmer is asking him about, but the two of them exchanging claims of weakness. It's getting quite punchy, but as you say, it's unlikely to cut through to the news bulletins.
Well, let's find out if either one of them can raise the tempo or the news content in the final exchange.
Keir Starmer.
You can always tell when he's losing, Mr. Speaker.
I want both sides. It's a very, very emotive and important issue. I need to hear the question and the answers. I certainly don't expect shouting from the backbenches.
Lindsay Hall's looking
Speaker,
at the
on
Tory
the Prime
backbenches
Minister's
there.
watch, rape prosecutions convictions are at a record low. Court backlogs are at a record high. Victims are waiting longer for justice, and criminals are getting away with it. This wasn't inevitable. It's the cost of a decade of Conservative cuts. And even now, the government isn't showing the urgency and ambition that's needed. Mr. Speaker, the Justice Secretary has done the rarest of things for this government and apologised. But I note the Prime Minister hasn't done that today. It's time he did, that he took some responsibility and backed it up with action. Will he do so?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I said to the right honourable gentleman, and I fought to have tougher action against rapists and sexual offenders throughout my time as Mayor of London, and of course to all the victims of rape and sexual violence, all the victims and survivors. Of course, I say sorry for the trauma that they have been through, the frustration that they go through because of the inadequacies of the criminal justice system. We are fixing that. We're fixing that by investing another £1 billion in clearing the court backlogs, in ensuring that they have people that they can listen to and entrust who will help them through the trials of the criminal justice experience, Mr. Speaker. But above all, we are helping them by getting our courts moving again. The fastest, most efficient way to do that, as he knows, is to get our country moving again, which is what we are doing with the fastest vaccination rollout anywhere in Europe, Mr. Speaker. We are getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker. They jabber, we jab, Mr. Speaker. They dither, we deliver. They vacillate, and we vaccinate, Mr. Speaker.
Just writing all of that down. Jab, 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 jabber, jab. Dither, deliver, vacillate, vaccinate. There we are. A new one for the history books there. Although, I mean, another worth thing for the history books, Keir Starmer did actually elicit an apology from Boris Johnson.
Well, I take it all back. In the end, he put Boris Johnson in a very difficult position, and Boris Johnson felt he had to say sorry. And that may get on the news, actually. And it was a pretty stealthy arrival at that point. I mean, I think Starmer reminds me a little bit of Gareth Southgate's England. There was a stat out by those Opta people who look at how things are playing. It said England advanced the ball at 0.7 metres per second, which is the slowest of any team in the tournament. And there is something of Keir Starmer's PMQs question construction about that. But in the end, he did nick a goal.
He managed to get Boris Johnson to say, of course, I'm sorry for about the frustrations and the inadequacies. He said he was sorry to victims of rape and other sexual offences and the frustrations of the inadequacies of the criminal justice system. So you're right. We were wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that was a decent outing in the end for Starmer. And what he needed was to get, he played at home, as we said. He nicked a goal at the end. And you can fairly say he edged that by the end of it. Boris Johnson's bravura summing up, which we'll be hearing those lines again, I'm sure, so we don't need to focus too closely on them because we'll yeah, if he thinks that works, tune in again next week.
Yes.
But it was a curiously sort of bravura response, having just apologised in the House of Commons.
Presumably a slight attempt to try and divert his own MP's attention from the fact he'd just been sort of cornered into making an apology. Jabber, we jab, they jabber, we jab, they dither, we deliver, they vacillate, we vaccinate.
He's nicking that one back, because the last time that was rolled out, Starmer nicked it and used it.
Where will it go next? Any ideas for 87212? Start your message with the word Times. Let us know in the usual way. Do you think that next week we've got the Batley and Spen by-election, which we were just talking about? There seems to be, we've gone from sort of, it's a safe Labour seat, the former seat of Joe Cox. It's, Labour can't possibly lose it. So now everyone is assuming that Labour will lose it. Is that now just priced in? Does that cause a real headache for Keir Starmer? Three by-elections this year, 3 losses?
I think were Labour to lose it, and most people I'm speaking to expect them to. I think that is an embarrassment and does cause him more problems. I mean, his problems are pretty obvious. He chucks the kitchen sink at the PM each week, and it doesn't seem to be having a great impact either on the Conservative Party's polling or on Boris Johnson's. And if you look at the wider picture, you've got a football tournament going on, the weather's getting better, and people are feeling reasonably good about vaccinations and the prospect, whisper it quietly, that they might even get a holiday. And it's not great terrain for the Labour Party until the autumn, when, as we wrote at the weekend, there's quite a lot of spending pledges that will come home to roost. And, once furlough starts lifting and jobs start being lost, and there appears to be a big row about how all this is paid for, then, Starmer will have an opportunity in the autumn to try and make some headway. I think what he needs to do is to make sure he's got the best possible team in place to capitalise on that when it happens. He's perfectly good. We've seen him, have good outings at PMQs, and we've seen him mount a credible challenge to some of what the government's doing. What he has not yet come up with is a big idea, some good sound bites, and something that cuts through. And we've seen flashes of him being a bit more human, doing that interview with Piers Morgan, but the public still doesn't really know who he is and what he stands for, and he needs some very, very good people around him in order to help project that to the nation at large.
In getting people to take notice. While we've been watching PMQs live from the House, outside the House of Commons, there's someone making a lot more noise, probably even more so than Keir Starmer. Richard Vaughan from the I newspaper has just tweeted saying, How is blasting Coolio's Gangster's Paradise across Parliament Square not disturbing the peace? I was there yesterday afternoon. There's some sort of...
As was I.
Yes.
I was trying to make phone calls to senior members of the government with this blaring away in the background.
What's it in aid of?
I have absolutely no idea.
Well, it's a campaign, it's a protest, which is definitely working. Tim Shipman, please go to the Sunday Times. Thanks very much for joining us. And of course, you can read Tim's fine work in the Sunday Times this weekend. Johnny Boy's been in touch saying, personally, I think Johnson's apology will do him great credit and help neutralise the issue. Not exactly a victory for Starmer to elicit it. I'm sure he'd rather Boris Johnson refuse to apologise. That is possibly true. And on the question of other slogans for Boris Johnson, Stephen has suggested, they doze, we dose, which is terrible, but is not. It doesn't necessarily rule out being used. And somebody on the text says, they do very little, we do Lulu like little.
Lulu Little was the designer who,
that's very good. That's
with the £800 wallpaper, which is falling off the walls in the flat above Downing Street.